That right there is my decision point, to be clear, between like, do I use D47, Lavlin D47, or 71B? That would be a decision-making point there, because I don't want to misquote, but one of those is good and okay to leave on lees, and one of them is not. I think D47 is the one that produces off flavors if you leave it too long on lees. The yeast that I usually select between are EC1118, because it's just an absolute workhorse. That's my go-to of, if I can't get it going, something's wrong, it's stalled, something's not right here, or I'm pushing a heavier ABV, it's going to be EC1118, because that's going to just eat every possible available sugar it can, and I won't have to worry about oxidizing it or anything like that, because it's just a beast. D47 was one that I used for a long time. I still do on occasion. 71B is one that I've used quite a bit, and I use that one quite a lot, especially for fruit or fruited meads, because it works well for that, I think. And then I just mentioned Kvike Voss is one I've tried recently that went quite well. I would use that again. I mean, that chewed through, like, that was the most active fermentation I've ever seen. Like, it was crazy. And the other one I use on occasion is USO5. And I find that one works pretty well for the lower ABV.
And that's originally a beer yeast, right?
Yeah. I think it's, it's used in beer a lot. I think it's an ale yeast is what it is. Yeah. So USO5 has kind of replaced D47 for me as a bit of like a workhorse standard one. I think the limit on that is about 12%. So that works well for like the 8 to 12% range ones. Then I'd use 71B for, I think that's like 14% or 16%, something like that. And then EC118. You've gotten 24? Did you step feed that?
No. That was a sizer. And
yeah, that'll happen on a sizer.
Yeah.
Speaking of,
huge sulfur aroma coming from that guy.
That's the highest one I made was a blueberry sizer, for the same reason. I forgot to account for the sugars in the apple juice completely. I put the honey in the blueberry. Oh yeah, it was. Yeah, I ended up at 23.5%, I think it was, and it was meant to be like an 18. It was meant to be like a really good 18, and I just kept measuring. And I was like, "What is happening?" And we wound up at 23.5.
Yeah, and the yeast will go.
Yeah.
Negative gravity points.
Yeah, so those are the ones I'm thinking about. That's kind of some of my decision making. If I want like the cleanest ferment I can get, it's probably going to be EC1118 or Kvike Voss, or one of the other Kvike ones, just because of how they're made. If I'm looking to get some different fruit flavors out of it, it's going to be 71B. If I'm looking to just make something, I'm probably going to start with USO5.
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts. One, for anyone that really wants to dive deeper on this topic, download the Scott Labs. It's right on the website. It's a PDF. It's free. And so what you do is you kind of read through it and say, this is the characteristic I'm looking for. This is the characteristic I'm not looking for. And that's kind of what Kieran's describing. You wind up building a little bit of vocabulary. And then you also build just go-tos. And that can be really important. If you think about it from recipe formulation in the kitchen, you want butter. You want to brown that meat, get that butter to brown. Without that, it's not going to happen. You just wind up burning your chicken. In the same way, you want to know what that yeast does, and that allows you to just use the same tools over and over again. The other thing that you mentioned, Voss Kvike, a couple times, and so I want to give the history behind that just real quick because it's so cool.
It's pretty neat.
Basically, all beer used to be wild beer, wild ferments, sour beer. 100% of all beer used to be sour. And so places like Belgium, Germany, they've developed traditions, and certain yeasts were cultivated on accident because they perform so well in that environment. So Kvike is the Norwegian version. And so it's a Norwegian farmhouse ale. And what happens is they would brew early in the season, right? It's during first harvest. They would malt their grains and then brew their beer. This yeast would inoculate itself from the area around, probably in the shed that they were using, the barn they were using. And then I've got a little bit of an echo and it's distracting me. I'm sorry. So that yeast would go through a Norwegian summer, which is a lot warmer than you think. You think of Alaska and Norway as being cold year round. In the middle of summer, it'll peak up around 100 degrees, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that yeast is just having to truck along at these really warm temperatures. And then after this short summer season, it gets cold really fast. So what we find is that certain Belgian yeast and certain Norwegian yeast have these huge temperature variances. What's fun about them from our perspective, today, we've isolated this yeast strain. We know exactly what we're getting. And so that yeast, we can manipulate certain flavors by knowing what temperature we're going to ferment at. So what I find is the Voskvike, it's going to ferment at close to 100 degrees. You get these bright green apple flavors, beautiful acidity, and just really complements a lot of honey. On the other hand, you ferment less than 80 degrees. You get these citrus notes, a little bit of pineapple, a little bit of orange zest, and that's a really cool yeast. Really takes a little bit of time to learn, but once you do, it's worth knowing.
Yeah, I was really excited to try it because I had done like a lot of research on it and saw a lot of people talking about it. And it's like one of those things where like mead makers in particular, but like brewers in general, be like, oh yeah, it's like a premium yeast, it's like oh, if you're brewing with that, you're doing something a little bit weird.
It's a little cutting edge.
It's a little cutting edge. Yeah, that's the word. Yeah, it's cutting edge. It's cutting edge. That's right.
10 years ago, nobody was using it.
No, and I don't think you could get it 10 years ago. Yeah. It was just very fun to try it out and see how it works. But like to your point about knowing the yeast, right? This is a good example. I know EC1118 really well because it's one of the first ones I started using, and I've used it a lot because, again, I like making sweeter meads and really heavier stuff generally, and that one has a higher ABV tolerance, so I use it a lot. And a buddy of mine probably about a month ago now, was starting his first batch of mead. And so he had gotten some stuff from one of his friends, and he had this yeast, and it was the EC1118, and he was using it. And he put it in, and he let it ride for like 2 weeks. And I was kind of like, oh, like, how's it going? We checked in. He measured the gravity. And he's like, it's only changed like 1%. I'm like, there's no way that's right. And so I checked in with him, made sure he was measuring his hydrometer right, because that can be a little bit tricky, especially if you haven't done it before. And ended up basically giving us some advice, and he ended up repitching. What ended up happening was the yeast he was using was like 5 years expired, and it wasn't kicking up, right? He pitched a brand new packet, and it like shot off right away. And I was like, that's the EC118 that I'm used to. You're going okay now. And like checked in with him the next day or two, and he described it. It's like, yeah, you're fully fermenting at this point. Where before it was like, I don't think the airlock activity or any of the other indications were actually there. But he wouldn't have known because he hadn't done it before.
Right. That'll be super interesting to see if there's any like diacetyl precursors or something like that. Although that usually comes, under pitching.
Yeah, it could be.
It'll be really interesting. I find that mead more than beer, if there's diacetyl present, it just pops.
Yeah.
Part of that's my process, because I don't complete fermentation and then treat with sulfites. That's a choice that I make. So I'm not getting those diacetyl precursors out. I'm not cleaning up. I'm not allowing the yeast to finish what it's wanting to do.
Yeah.
And so some of that's on me as a mead maker, and that affects the approach, which is part of our conversation tonight.
Yeah.
So you come up with an idea. You got a primary flavor.
Yep.
A secondary flavor. 3 pounds of honey per gallon.
Yep.
And you're good to go.
Yeah, generally speaking, I mean that's pretty much my approach. And then it just depends, like I said, depends on the target audience, right? So if I'm making a blueberry sizer because I know that's what one of my buddies likes, and I'm making a batch for him because I don't know, that seems like a fun gift or whatever the case is, you know. Okay, I'll start off with 3 pounds per gallon, but I also know that I'm adding blueberries, and I also know that I'm adding apple cider or apple juice, and I've learned the lesson now, and I had to learn this that one time. Right now, I know forever. I'm always remembering that the apple conveys a significant amount of sugars, and I factor that into the calculation. So my baseline is 3 pounds, but if I'm aiming for 10%, let's say ABV mead, I'm not going to put in 3 pounds per gallon
That's
because
right.
I'm adding 3 pounds of blueberry full and a half a gallon or a gallon of apple juice to a 2.5 gallon batch or to a 5 gallon batch. Obviously, you get the volume ratios, but I'm adding about 50% of the volume of the container in terms of the juice, and then also 3 or 4 pounds of the raw berries. And I also will say too, I do add pectic enzyme is a thing that I do
Mhm.
now for fruit. I just like that it breaks it down. If I can, I don't want to get too nerdy into it too much. I know I'm trying to be cognizant, but the things that I've
No,
learned
no.
is that I freeze the fruit. Frozen fruit works really well for me. It breaks down the cellulose a little bit, breaks down those cell walls so that that flavor gets released a little bit easier. And then typically what I do is when I'm getting ready, I'll sanitize my primary ferment vessel. I'll throw the fruit right in there, throw some pectic enzyme in that, and whatever my like a little bit of base liquid, so that's water or a little bit of black tea for some extra tannin, if I think I need it. Depends on the recipe, or like that juice, the apple juice, whatever. I'll put that in there a little bit, get that sitting for a little while I'm prepping all the other stuff, while I'm getting the honey ready, or usually when I am making a batch, I'm making like 7 batches at once because I just don't like mixing up a bunch of sanitizer. And it's honestly the reason. It's honestly the reason. I'm going to make 1 bucket of sanitizer. I'm going to do like 5 batches at the same time because I just don't want to have to make another batch of sanitizer over and over and over again. And it stays good for a little bit, but only so long. And so I'll get that sitting with the pectic enzyme, lets that chill for a little bit, warms the fruit up a little bit too, so it won't shock the yeast. That's another thing I think about is the fact that I am using frozen fruit. If I just throw the yeast in there, it might be really slow. It might prevent it from fermenting because it's like stressing it, or it's too cold for it to be activated. So let it warm up, do the pectic enzyme, let that chill for a little bit, let that break it down, um, and then start the batch and let it ride for. Usually I let stuff ride for like a week or two before I check it. I just let it sit, be patient.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
So, do you use any yeast nutrient?
I do. I typically use Fermaid O.
You put
Uh,
it all in up front then?
Depends on the recipe. If I'm step feeding, I do not put it in up front. I don't step feed that
Okay.
often though. Most of mine are nutrient up front. The honey is all up front, and then I utilize a secondary flavoring or a secondary fermentation to finish it out. But when I step feed, it's going to be checking it every few days. If it's a really heavy fruit meat, I do buckets also for clarity. That's a thing I've learned. I started off using like the 1 gallon glass jug carboys, and I figured out really quick that I didn't like cleaning those, especially because a lot of the meads I was making were really active and were making a lot of krausen, and it was like really hard to get off. It was like that sticky stuff just inside
Mhm.
the vessel, really hard to get it off. It was a pain in the butt. And so I switched over, and so my primary fermentation vessels at this point are almost exclusively giant plastic buckets. I do a lot of big 5 gallon batches. I start off with that, and then I'll split that off into a 1 or 2 or a 2.5 gallon
Right.
smaller bucket, or a carboy to do a different flavoring. So sometimes
Which
I
is
do
how
that too.
blueberry sizer winds up with as an estrogen.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. And that's like, and so like going to that example, it's like I started off and I was like, well, I want to make, I want to make an ace, I want to make a blueberry cider, I want to make a cherry. I got a bunch of black cherry juice. I got a bunch of lime juice. What am I going to make, right? And so I started off with a 5 gallon batch of something, and then turned that into 2.5 gallons of blueberry cider and 2 gallons of a cherry limeade sessionable, and 2 gallons of a Perry mead sessionable, and 1 gallon of a black cherry buckwheat, and like just some of those things. Like that black cherry buckwheat one, that's an experiment. Like that is fully an experiment. It's a good example of, I had black cherry juice. I've made a black cherry mead previously that was phenomenal. And I was like, but what if I added buckwheat honey to it in secondary, which is not something people usually do. And it turned out pretty good because it cut the flavors really differently.
So it probably replaced a little bit of like a tannin, or added in a little bit of sour element too.
Oh yeah, I think you have a bottle of it, so at some point you'll try it and you'll let me know if it's good or not.
I definitely will.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I've taken about 30 minutes of your time. I'm probably going to jump off.
Cool.
I think I'm going to rewatch this, and I'm going to try and do, and I'm speaking to anyone who's watched this, what I'm going to try and do is break down some of our conversation and ask the question that I would have if I hadn't been doing this for the last 10 years. And then use that to develop a little bit of a curriculum if I can. And we'll have future conversations. So that's my plan. Next week, we're gonna make mead live. I want to give you just a second, because we have in a Venn diagram of mead drinkers and mead makers and people who are going to watch a 30-minute video of people nerding out about mead. In that Venn diagram, some of them like LARP. So would you like to talk about that at all?
Sure, man. And thank you. Yeah, I'm really involved in the live action role play games in the New England region. I play at a few. I've helped run a few. I've helped run one of the biggest.
To the point where players seek him out
as
a writer.
Yeah. And I'm starting one myself along with a team of people. It's my little shirt here. And we ran a Kickstarter to get some funds ready for it. And we actually fully funded it in the first 17 hours, which is a huge show of support and faith in the community.
Yeah, it's kick-ass.
We're really excited. Yeah, I play at a couple games. I highly recommend, if you ever thought about it even a little, and you're like, that's too nerdy. That was me a few years ago, and just go try it. And worst case scenario, you have a fun little camping trip and meet some friends. Best case scenario, you find a new hobby that you carry with you for your life. So definitely recommend it.
Cool. When I post this tonight, we're pre-recording this. I got dinner with some friends tonight, and Kieran was nice enough to adjust and film a little early. But when I post tonight, go ahead and comment with the link, which won't make sense to anyone who doesn't watch the video, and that's fine. And then I will copy and paste it into Instagram as well.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Well, I appreciate it. And as always, it's great to talk mead with you.
Yeah, you too, man. All right. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon, Kieran. Everyone else, cheers, bitches.